How good is your vision? There's an Israelite spy in our army, accused the king of Aram. The king of Israel knows every move we make. Sire, it's true the king of Israel knows our plans, but there are no traitors in our ranks, replied an officer. Well, then how does he know? Barked the king. An Israelite prophet, known as Elisha, tells him all our plans. Apparently his God reveals our plans to him, and Elisha passes them on to the king of Israel. King of Aram thought for a moment and then responded, well, take a division of soldiers and capture him. I want this stopped. So the Aramean general took infantrymen with charioteers and marched on Dothan, where Elisha was located. Arriving at night, they surrounded the city of Dothan. Elisha's servant, who is unnamed, perhaps we'll call him Yare, Hebrew for he feared, went out early in the morning. He came running back in terror. Elisha, Elisha, my lord, what shall we do? We're surrounded by the Aramean army. Elisha responded, don't be afraid. Those who are with us are more than those who are with them. Now, I can imagine Yare may have voiced, or at least thought, what are you talking about, sir? We're all alone. I don't see the army of Israel. I only see the army of the Arameans, and there's just no way of escape. Then I imagine Elisha probably sighed and then prayed, "Oh Lord, open his eyes that he may see." And then the Lord opened the servant's eyes, and he looked and saw the hills full of horses and chariots of fire all around Elisha. You see, Yare saw only the problems. He did not see God's provision. He was not seeing through the eyes of faith. The question we may ask today is, are you a Yare or an Elisha? When the problems come, and they will, when the enemy surrounds you, and he will, when the obstacles cross your path, and they will, when there seems to be no solution, when it appears that you cannot win, are you an Elisha or a Yara? Do you see only the problems, or do you trust in God's provision? I think Yara is like many of us. He worked diligently for Elisha and for the Lord. He was a willing helper. You could count on him to serve as needed. But it seems his faith was small, his vision poor. Now, many older people develop cataracts on their eyes, beginning as minute, cloudy spots on the lens of the eye. These cataracts grow and eventually pervade the whole lens, turning it a milky yellow-white and scattering incoming light and blocking vision. I think many of us develop spiritual cataracts. Something happens to discourage us. Clouds of doubt begin to cloud our spiritual vision. At first, they're so small as to be barely noticeable, but they're there. Perhaps in the form of reluctance to be involved in the church, perhaps in a fear of failure when God tugs at your heart to serve him in some way. They may begin with hectic schedules that make it difficult to be consistent with Bible study and prayer and corporate worship. And as those spiritual cataracts grow, we may find that we more often doubt God's ability to use us, and we shy away from new challenges to serve because the eyes of our faith are cloudy. Perhaps we still read our Bibles and attend worship, but the study of God's Word and worship are simply a kind of a routine. And our joy has largely disappeared. Before long, our spiritual eyes are clouded and we see God as if we're looking through a waterfall. That's the reason the ancient Greeks gave the disease this name. But an operation can cure that problem by removing the cataracts and performing a lens implant. One's vision can be restored. I remember one time Joyce and I visited my grandparents. We met them at church in the town of Thamesford, and after church followed them to their place in East London. And as we traveled towards their place, I noticed that Grandma was sitting right next to Grandpa in the middle of the seat. This was, of course, back when they had bench seats in the front seat of cars. And I commented to Joyce that they were just like young lovers. Well, when I got to their place, I mentioned this to them, whereupon I discovered that Grandma sat close in order to read the road signs to Grandpa, because his vision was clouded by cataracts and he couldn't read them. And of course, she didn't drive. Well, several months later, he had a lens implant operation and the cataracts were removed and his vision was good again. Yara's eyes were clouded by challenges of daily life. Cataracts of complications obstructed his vision. Cataracts of unbelief blinded him to God's provision. And so when he looked out and saw the Aramean army, he saw only the problem, the impossible situation. All he could think of was surrender. The cataracts of unbelief blinded him to the true situation that Elisha could see. You see, cataracts of unbelief made him forget that greater is he that is in us than he that is in the world. Cataracts of unbelief made it impossible for him to see that we are more than conquerors through him who loved us. Cataracts of unbelief blinded him to the truth that God is able to do immeasurably more than all we ask or imagine according to his power that is at work within us. Yahweh needed a spiritual eye operation. He needed those cataracts of unbelief removed. He needed an implant of the lens of faith. Sometimes we are like that in the church and in our daily lives. We look at the problems, we look at the impossibilities, and we factor God out. Perhaps in the trials of these last several months, you've been overwhelmed and like Elisha's servant see only the problems and have been unable to see God's provision. Oh, we need an implant of the lens of faith. When Nehemiah returned to build the wall of Jerusalem, the critics said, "Impossible, you can't do it." But Nehemiah inspired the people by sharing how God had already moved the heart of the king to appoint him, Nehemiah, as governor and to provide funding for the project. And after that inspirational talk, we read, they replied, "Let us start rebuilding." And so they began this good work. They endured ridicule. They met with false accusations. They faced threats. But because the visionary leadership of Nehemiah, they did not quit. And in only 52 days, the walls and the gates of Jerusalem were rebuilt. What others said was impossible, they accomplished. What they had been earlier too discouraged to try, they completed after they received new vision. Where once they saw only problems, where once they perceived only obstacles, through Nehemiah, they beheld God's provision and power. They could see it. How is your vision today? Are you like the dejected citizen or a Nehemiah? Or consider the young shepherd David. When visiting his brothers at the battlefront, he heard the taunts of the giant Goliath. He saw the fear in the eyes and voices of Israeli soldiers. Saul and his soldiers saw only the size and strength of Goliath. David saw the size and strength of his God. And so he asked, who's this uncircumcised Philistine that he should defy the armies of the living God? When others doubted, David remembered past demonstrations of God's power and provision and declared, let no one lose heart on account of this Philistine. Your servant will go and fight him. And of course, we know he killed Goliath. You see, David had eyes of faith. The other soldiers were blinded by cataracts of unbelief. How's your vision today? Are you an Israelite soldier or a David? Or we could look at Joshua, Caleb, and the 10 other spies who returned from reconnaissance in Canaan. They reported that the land was beautiful and bountiful, truly a land flowing with milk and honey. But the people there were big and powerful, and the cities well fortified. 10 of the spies said, well, it was a nice dream, but there's no way we can conquer the land. Joshua and Caleb agreed that the inhabitants were mighty, that the cities were well fortified, that they were weak by comparison. But they declared that God could deliver them, that God could give them victory over the inhabitants of the land, that they should factor in the power of God. But the people went with the majority. They decided it couldn't be done. Even though Joshua and Caleb reminded them of God's miraculous works in the past, how he had delivered them out of Egypt, how he had parted the waters of the Red Sea, how he had provided food and water in the wilderness, and still they wouldn't believe. Consequently, they spent 40 years wandering around in the wilderness until the doubting generation had died off. 40 years later, Joshua led them into Canaan, and Caleb was there too, and God gave them victory. So how is your vision today? Are you like one of the 10 who said, it was a nice dream, but it can't be done? Are you like Joshua and Caleb who believe that God can provide? Is your vision filled with clouds of doubt? Or do you see the Lord clearly? Are you going through a time of personal testing? Maybe you're looking for work. Nothing seems to be out there. Can you trust God to open the door? Or perhaps you've had financial woes, particularly in these recent times. Can you believe that in spite of the difficulties, God will provide? Possibly you or a family member is suffering from disease or illness. You don't know how you can endure. Can you believe in the healing or sustaining grace of God? It could be that you have been faithfully serving the Lord. You're working to the best of your abilities, but you just seem to see little or no fruit, and you're discouraged. Because of unbelief, Yari couldn't see the army of God. If you are discouraged today, if you are defeated today, if you're so far down that you have to look up to see bottom, ask God to open the eyes of your faith, to take away the cataracts of unbelief. How good is your vision? Sometimes, like Yari, all we see are the obstacles, and we forget about God. We forget about God's almighty power. We need to have those cataracts removed. How good is your vision? What was the secret of men like Elisha or Nehemiah or David or Joshua or Caleb? Why could they see God's power and provision while others around them saw only obstacles and impossibilities? Well, I think first of all, they communed with God. These men know God intimately. They spent time praying and listening to God. They did more than just give God a list of things they wanted. They talked with him. They submitted to him. They listened to God's Spirit speak to them. They confessed their sin to him. They acknowledged their unworthiness to him. And they trusted him. Secondly, they remembered God's previous provision. They looked back, not on a specific method of provision necessarily, but on the fact that God provided. And so they believed that since God provided in the past, he could and would continue to provide, even if they didn't know how he would do it. And thirdly, they obeyed God. When God told them to do something, they did it. Nehemiah rebuilt the wall. David slew the giant. Joshua and Caleb entered the land. When Yahweh struggled with fear and doubt, Elisha declared, "Don't be afraid. Those who are with us are more than those who are with them." And then he prayed, "O Lord, open his eyes that he may see." And the Lord opened the servant's eyes, and he saw the hills full of horses and chariots of fire all around Elisha. We need to see God's power and provision in our lives and in our ministry. We need to remember that we serve the Lord Christ, who died and rose again, forever victorious over sin and the grave. Therefore, my dear friends, stand your ground. Don't hold back. Throw yourself into the work of the Master, confident that nothing you do for him is a waste of time or effort. God bless.